Have you ever considered that the problem might be you?
It always seemed to be somebody else's issue. I went quiet and I let the silence work its magic. The average tenure of a CRO is around about 18 months, which is significantly lower than that of other C-suite positions. And I'm a big believer in consistency, even if you are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's better to be consistently wrong than randomly correct.
Welcome to The Vault. Welcome to episode 2 of the Next and Future podcast. I'm Matt, and along with Joel, we run Next and Future, a strategy studio. And today we're going to be speaking to Simon. I met him last year and we hit it off straight away because we have so many shared ideas and things that we enjoy talking about. And around the time that I met him, he launched his book, which is Stop Managing, Start Leading. And so we're going to dig into some of the topics from that today. I really enjoyed reading it. I feel like if you're emerging in as a sales leader, you'd probably get a kind of 5-year shortcut by reading this book in terms of your kind of learning and leadership development. So, but let me hand over to you. Why don't you give us a proper introduction?
Thanks, Matt. So I'm Simon. I'm a sales leadership and performance coach. I work with chief revenue officers, VPs of sales, sales managers to help them build high growth teams. I look at this through coaching, sales transformation, helping them establish long-term sustainable growth within their organization. With regards to the book, it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but it's the book that I wish I'd had when I first went into sales leadership almost 30 years ago. So that is all of my experience, plus the experience of many great leaders that I work with, rolled into a single publication.
Lovely, all put together in one place. So just so that we can start to get to know you a little bit, tell us about an exciting adventure that you've been on.
So probably the most recent exciting adventure was actually last year. For my wife's birthday, we took the kids to Thailand, the land of smiles, which it very much is. It's a beautiful country, beautiful experience for the children. To see the contrast between the north, the mountains, the jungle, etc., the beaches in the south, and then the hustle and bustle of Bangkok in the middle. Great adventure for all of us, and aligns with two of the things that are most important to me, which is my family and the opportunity to travel, to meet new people, to experience new cultures.
Yeah, amazing. Good stuff. So, getting into the book, we won't read the whole thing, but the first line says, "Have you ever considered that the problem might be you?" Why don't you unpack that for us?
Okay, so that was with a client of mine, 20 minutes into a first meeting, and talking about many of the issues that I see week in, week out with clients that I work with. And the main point that the individual was making was, it always seemed to be somebody else's issue, somebody else's problem, somebody else's challenge. And I just thought it appropriate at that point to challenge really, and to suggest, well, maybe if you've got all of these different problems, maybe start by looking at yourself. And as I say in my book, I went quiet and I let the silence work its magic. If I told you the truth.
That was the end. That was it.
Yeah.
And is that a type of pattern that you see often when meeting sales leaders?
Absolutely. Often I'll engage with organizations, with leaders who present a certain problem to me, a certain challenge. But often when you explore it, what's being presented is not really the root cause of the issue. And this for me is one of the things that we really need to sort of step back at and look at. It's a challenging environment that we work in. You know, the world at the moment is difficult, geopolitical challenges, economic issues, and then we look at technology. I'm sure we'll talk about that. There's lots of pressures on organizations, and in particular on sales leaders within those organizations. And it's very tempting that when I'm faced with a challenge to look for an immediate solution, or in the case of my client there, to look at the problem being somebody else's. Invariably it's not. Invariably it sits within us, but also the solution sits within us. And my role really is to try and explore that with the client, to try and get them to understand what's really happening for them and what's the best approach to address that. And as I said, often it's not what is presenting to them, it's something else, something more fundamental.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, you mentioned it's a challenging role. We're always interested in thinking about the short term and the long term at Next and Future, but you know, the average role kind of tenure for a C-suite executive is usually 5 to 7 years. When we look at a chief revenue officer, it's about 18 months. Why is that the case?
I have my view of why I think that's the case, and I think a lot of this is about misalignment in terms of expectation, misalignment in terms of responsibility and role. The Revenue Operations Association suggests that there are around about 40 levers that contribute to revenue growth. Unfortunately, many of those do not sit within the remit of the Chief Revenue Officer. And I think what happens is over that period of time is there's an element of frustration from the individual. The sales leader is giving up too early because they may not be getting the support, they may not have the right levels of control within the organisation to make the change that they want to see. Or there's frustration from the organisation because they're not seeing the results as quickly as they would like to.
And so from the different types of roles, because one of the things that seems to be challenging with some of the sales leadership roles is how some of the roles have evolved from being a sales director to a chief sales officer to a chief revenue officer. Talk about that shift that you've seen over the last 2 decades or so.
Yeah, and again, I think this comes back to some of the challenges. So in the early 2000s, we saw the evolution of the chief revenue officer. The idea of the chief revenue officer is to have control over the revenue levers, those elements that impact revenue growth and what we do. The Revenue Operations Association suggests there are probably 40 levers. Now, not all of those should come under the direct control of the Chief Revenue Officer, but many of them should. I think what we're seeing, however, is we're seeing title changes, but not necessarily being supported by what the definition and responsibility of the role actually is. So whilst an individual may carry the title of a Chief Revenue Officer, in effect what they are is a VP of Sales. So they have responsibility for the sales function, but many of those other levers and elements that affect revenue growth are not under their direct control.
Yeah.
Now, this has an impact on an individual in terms of their ability to understand, the various elements, the nuances of how the organisation operates, their ability to influence and affect other parts of the organisation. But what it results in is almost siloed working. So we have elements of the organisation performing to their KPIs and their objectives, but those things are not necessarily aligned.
Yeah. And I'm interested, so you talked about if it's happening by 18 months or sooner, then somebody's given up. Do you have a view on how long does it take to implement a full system from the tactics up to the leadership that really works and delivers in that environment?
In my opinion, every sales leader should have their playbook. Now, the playbook needs to be adaptable to what's happening within the environment, but the playbook should be something that you have purposefully designed that aligns with the environment that you're operating in and towards the goals that you're working towards. Too many allow this just to happen by default. They follow processes that have been in place for many, many years. They follow behaviors that they've experienced in the past, rather than thinking through what's right for me and what's right for the organisation. And the full development of that playbook and the blueprint that supports it, I think is a key focus for revenue leaders. And likewise, from the organisation's perspective, what is it that they're trying to achieve? So is this the right person who is able to execute on the strategy and the direction that you're working towards? And where I see the fall down, particularly in early stage of individuals, I have examples of this, is where there's a misalignment there. So an individual believes that their role is X, the organisation wants them to perform Y.
Yeah.
And that's where some of that difficulty comes in.
Yeah. And the last time we met over coffee, we had a really interesting conversation about the long-term approach at Man City and the way that things are happening at Man United at the moment. And in one aspect, really clarity from the bottom up all the way through the organisation, and maybe some mismatches there. So do you want to touch on some of the interesting bits we covered then?
Yeah, obviously as a Manchester City fan, I'm quite happy with what's happening at United. I don't know if you would agree, that's it. I'm always hesitant to use sporting analogies and so on, but sometimes it helps and you can work it through. if you look at something like a Manchester City, they have a very robust infrastructure that goes all the way from the early stage academies, etc., all the way through to the senior teams. A way they play, the way they attract players, the way they reward, etc., and what their ambition is and what they're trying to achieve. Now, Manchester United had this, but I think over the past decade or so have lost it in some way. And when you look at Manchester United, you can't say it's the players. They have world-class players. Can you really say it's the manager? I'm not sure. They have world-class managers who've succeeded elsewhere. So therefore, is there something else that's sitting behind this? So if you take, for instance, recently with Amorim, fundamentally a great coach, had success, has come in, but he's the first person to come in that role who's positioned as a coach, not the manager. And this was something he challenged within that process. So he had responsibility and he was accountable for the performance of the team, but didn't necessarily have control over who they were recruiting, how they were bringing it in, and other aspects that contribute to the overall performance. And I think that's where you see that breakdown. You saw that with them. His position became untenable, both for himself and the organisation. Where they go now, who knows?
Yeah, interesting. And so, where does that tension tend to exist when it's a chief revenue officer? Is that with the CEO who holds the strategy? Is it across the C-suite? Is it external stakeholders?
I'll give you an example of this. I was working with an individual whom at the time I didn't know, I wasn't working with them, but she took on the responsibility of the chief revenue officer. $50 million organisation, PE backed, in fact had only just been acquired by the PE, and was brought in to sort of set the revenue function going. Shortly after arriving and working it through, she realised that actually many of the things that she was going to be held accountable for, she didn't control, she didn't have that responsibility. In effect, she was a VP of sales. She had responsibility for the sales team, but marketing sat outside of that, demand generation sat outside of her responsibility, even to the point of reporting. So there was no revenue operations team. Everything was done through finance reporting, etc. And yet every 2 weeks she was reporting to the board on revenue performance and how the organisation was moving forward. She lasted less than 6 months. In part, that was her choosing to leave because she recognised that she was unable to achieve the things that she wanted to achieve based on the way it was structured. In part, it was her leaving. In part, the organisation were probably recognising that she may not be the right person. The truth is, if we step back, she probably was the right person, but there was a misalignment in terms of responsibility, goals, direction. She was feeling pressure from many areas, from the CEO, from the PE, but also her colleagues. She was trying to influence change within the organisation that they were not necessarily receptive to. And that then became the challenge for her moving forward.
So for a new chief revenue officer coming in, what are the first things that they have to crack? What are the things that they have to get right straight away? And what are maybe some of the longer term things that they need to work on over time?
So I think, again, the alignment in terms of role, clarity around expectations, standards, responsibility within there, what I will be held accountable for, etc. Is all of those elements. Within this, again, I need to understand obviously the organisation. If I'm new to the organisation, I need to understand who the key people are. I need to understand how we perform, what it is we're doing in the market. There's all of the natural things that you would do entering into an organisation. But I think it's also very important to lay down what your plan looks like. And this, again, understanding the work that you and Joel do is understanding how do I translate the strategy into the operation and what it is that we're going to do. One of the issues I find is that the idea of strategy is often missing or is wrong. We have strategy built up in the way of goals or fancy aspirations or maybe tactical plans. But that isn't how I view strategy. I know it's not how you view strategy. And having clarity around what it is that we're trying to do there, how we communicate that, how we translate that into initiatives and coherent action that we take forward, again, I think is a challenge for many. And some of this is because of their background, what they've been experienced in, or what they've been exposed to, what their own understanding is. There's a piece of research that was done by the Chartered Institute of Management who said that 82% of first-line managers have had no formal training or development. They call them the accidental manager. The challenge with that is we're setting a foundation that is shaky. If people are coming in with little or no development in that area and low exposure, and then we're asking them to perform at a different level in a different way, that sets us up for failure going forward. Now, what happens at that first line level is a salesperson gets promoted, and what they do is they fall back on the skills and the activities that they know well. So they get involved in deals. They get involved in solving the problems for their people. While they're doing that, the next level then has to step in to cover their role. And this is what we see throughout the whole organization. What we've got to recognize is an individual going from sales person into management or moving through. These are not simply promotions. These are career progressions and require the right level of support in order for somebody to succeed.
Yeah, interesting. And this is one of the topics that I reflected on lots after one of our conversations, is actually, where do you see that in other areas across the business of people kind of finding it hard to step up into true leadership and move away from the thing that they've been really good at? And I think you can see that in lots of areas, but that analogy really stuck with me. What are the biggest improvements, or what are the biggest opportunities for an emerging sales leader to make that leap, to kind of almost jump the gap?
Buy my book.
So can you expand a bit on the journey of what it looks like from being a great salesperson through the organisation into leadership?
So I think this is the interesting piece, particularly in sales. Typically what happens is high-performing salespeople get promoted into management positions. And the move from individual contributor to a manager is not just a promotion, it's a completely different career move. The work by Ram Chanan, Stephen Drotter and Jim Knoll, the leadership pipeline, they talk about the transition from each of these levels, from individual contributor to first line and beyond. And they talk about different skill sets that are required. They talk about different values that are required. They also talk about different time horizons that are required. An individual contributor is almost looking at what's immediately in front of them. They recognize that if I want to achieve more, I probably can work a little bit harder. I can put the effort in, but it's about me. The transition into manager is completely different. Different time horizon that I need to be looking much further ahead. I need to have a different set of skills. So it's not just about me working harder. It's not necessarily about me solving problems, which is what an individual contributor does. It's more about the identification of this and what is it that we need to put in place that provides a long-term solution to the challenges that we face. I think this is where the issue lies in how we promote people. And then what happens is that first line manager, absent of some of the key skills, values and time frame, they get promoted again. And this is why I believe people are operating at a level lower. So what I'll typically see in a sales organization is first line sales managers who are almost superstar salespeople. They get involved directly in opportunities. Sometimes they do it because they enjoy it. That's what they were good at. They enjoy it. Sometimes they do it because they believe that if I don't rescue this, things are going to go wrong. And their view of performance is if I work harder, I can perform more. But it's not about your performance, it's about the team, your team, and how you support and how you help them. Now the challenge, as I say, then just builds and builds as individuals move through the organizations.
One of the things that we've looked at in previous businesses when I was in more in the creative and technical space was looking at people that were exceptional at what they did and would move up through the ranks, but actually didn't feel like they had the skill set or the desire to manage or line manage other groups of people. And we started to look at kind of putting them on different tracks towards a kind of principal or architect level, whether that's engineers or designers or so on, that allowed them to be recognized as brilliant at what they do, but not having to take on the responsibility of management if that wasn't a good fit for them. Have you seen that type of thing working in sales?
Yeah, absolutely. And the better organizations, the ones who are thinking further ahead and what, the impact on individuals, start to build in programs like this. So as I've said, if you're a high performing salesperson, then the natural next step is to move into management. But that is not, as I said, a promotion. It's a different career move. So what some organizations are looking for is, so how do we keep that sort of individual contributor, that specialist area going for the individual, but give them the things that they're looking for. So what is it that they're requiring when they make these moves? Now, some of that might be around remuneration and reward. Yes, it could be. Having said that, within sales, obviously we have commissions, and that's something that can be appropriately looked at and worked through. But in a lot of cases, if we think around motivation and setting aside direct reward and recognition, in some people they're looking for maybe a little bit more control about what they do, a little bit more autonomy. Maybe they're looking for a say, so to contribute to the organization, not just their role, but can I input into where we're going? Can I input into the challenges that we're facing? Can I help this through? And I think the organizations that are recognizing that, so you don't have to move into leading people to then contribute to strategy, to contribute to initiatives that we're putting in place. Actually, you can be a key contributor to that whilst maintaining the specialist, sales role. I think those are the things that we need to be looking for.
And there's an interesting balance there, the kind of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, isn't there? There's like, yes, more salary, great, benefit, so on, but actually the other parts of the role that motivate people.
I think this is particularly a challenge in sales. We talk about sales. There's a phrase, the coin-operated salesperson. It's a term I've heard many times, and it's one that frustrates me. The assumption there is that people are only in sales for the money. Now, don't get me wrong. I know that money, commission, etc. is an important part, but you're quite vulnerable as a leader if you genuinely believe that, because the vulnerability comes from the fact that that person will walk for a better offer. So what you're saying is that your salespeople are prepared to go elsewhere if they are offered a better salary, a better reward. I challenge that because I think it does a discredit to the individual if you think that way. You've got to recognize them as a human being. And we all have different motivations, we all have different requirements and needs. And I quite like the work of where we start to look at intrinsic value. What's the individual trying to achieve? What's important to them? And how do I as a leader align with the needs that they have as an individual? By doing that, we create more loyalty, discretionary effort, a better team dynamics. The absence of that, as I say, we're vulnerable. Now, I like the work of Eric Deci and Richard Ryan. So for over 30 years, they've been looking at the idea around intrinsic motivation and their theory around self-determination. They look at the idea around autonomy. They look at the idea around mastery and competence. They look at the idea of relatedness, purpose. Why am I doing this? How do I relate to the organization? These are stronger areas for us to focus on as leaders when we're working with our people. Now, that's not to say that we take away some of those extrinsic motivators and rewards, but it's aligning it with what does the individual look for? How do I help develop the individual? How can I help the individual become a better person?
And so sticking with that kind of long-term lens, in the book you talk about kind of doing the work on themselves personally and their values and understanding what that looks like, but then also the culture and then the kind of long-term capability building and succession planning. Talk about some of those long-term initiatives in that sense.
Yeah, so, and again, my book talks about, first of all, identify what the challenge is that you're facing. So you don't want to just firefight or a knee-jerk reaction to an issue that presents itself. And I see this a lot in organizations. What they tend to do is they react to things. They put in place an initiative or what they perceive as a solution, but it's basically a Band-Aid that keeps falling off and working through. What tends to happen is you then get a layering of this, the layering of a new initiative, the layering of a new priority, and before long you've overcomplicated the situation you find yourself in. So that's one challenge that we face. So I think identifying your challenge root cause, what is it I'm going to focus on, what is it I need to do? The other bit, as you mentioned there, is then who you are. So how do you show up? What is it that you're looking for? And again, I think this challenge is people get promoted, they move into positions, without necessarily understanding what is it that they want to achieve from this, what is it they're looking for. And I wrote something recently, is that when somebody moves into a new position, there's a celebration of that success. I've been promoted, everything's great. Very few people think about, how will this end? What is it that I actually want to have achieved in this? Because every position will end. How it ends is questionable. But if I think about how it's going to end and what I want to achieve, what's the legacy that I want to have created here, I think that changes the mindset in terms of how we move forward. And it allows for much more of a longer term thinking, not just reacting to the problem that's immediately in front of me, but thinking through, so what is it I'm trying to achieve here? What does success ultimately look like? And where do I get to? Now, in order to do that, I have to have a pretty good understanding of who I am. I also have to have an element of confidence in terms of who I am. Again, one of the things I mentioned in the book is that some people move into a leadership position, management position, however you want to phrase it. They do it for some level of reward. They do it for some level of esteem. You know, I've got a better title now, I have more people working under me, and so on. I think that if you're moving into these positions for that, I think you're doing it for the wrong reason. It shouldn't be the title. It shouldn't be that because I've got this, I have more people who adore me or look to me. You know, leadership isn't about that. Leadership isn't about the fact that I've got a title and therefore people have to follow me. It should be a choice that people want to. And they do that if confident individuals who have an understanding of the value that they can bring, have a belief in the people that they're working with and want to develop them, and create a legacy, as I say, for the organization they operate in. I think, you know, that they compel people to follow. But too few people think that way. It's almost as though we're in a survival mode because of the 18 months, average 18 months, the challenge that we face, that all I'm trying to do here is survive in the moment, as opposed to thinking about what does it look like to thrive.
And we always want to bring it back to strategy. So one of the questions that I'm interested in is, can you do sales well with a bad overall strategy?
Interesting question. The points I would pick up on there is, what do we mean by bad strategy? The other point is, can you do sales well? So depending on how we define that, can sales individuals, organizations, can they hit their targets, etc.? Potentially. Will they ever perform at the highest level? Will they achieve the greatest success that they potentially are capable for without a solid and strong strategy? And I would suggest no. And again, I think this is a challenge that often strategy is confused with things like aspirations, goals, etc., and then maybe, you know, some actions or initiatives. But I think it's more fundamental to that. And there's a few things for me is, there are certain systems that support organization, like a blueprint. Sanford did research around here where they looked at the DNA of, you know, organizations, and they looked at how emerging organizations, what is it that they do differently when they perform versus the ones that don't. And they talk about the idea of a blueprint. The systems that support the culture, the systems that support the strategy. And one of the things that I find interesting when I work with organizations is often these systems have evolved. They're there by almost default rather than by design. So if I think about this, for me, there are sort of 4 systems that we would look at that support this. One is the fundamental sort of system blueprint. What is it that we do in terms of you know, repeatable processes, roles, responsibility, that type of thing? That needs to be very clear what the standards are that we are operating towards, what's required from the individuals within the organization and where we're moving. There is also a system or blueprint around communication. Now, in a sales organization, you're looking at your communication cadence, you're looking at reporting, so things like forecasting, pipeline development, etc. You're looking at how you're communicating both externally to your clients, but importantly to your people and where you are. The third system I look at is the idea of the people system. So who is it? Who is it that we should be recruiting? How do we recruit them? How do we onboard and then develop them? And then, as we talked about earlier, how do you enable those people to progress? What is it that you do? Now, again, do we have a system that supports that, that's repeatable, that we can understand and that we can improve when necessary? And then the final one is more around sort of culture, vision. and standards. It's around the behaviours that we tolerate, standards that we expect. It's about how we make decisions. Now, as I said earlier, I think in a lot of cases, any organisation has this. It's whether they've designed them or whether they've just happened. And often what is in place is it's just happened.
Yeah.
Now, this comes back to my earlier point, is that then when an issue presents itself or a challenge, we immediately respond with some sort of band-aid, a solution for it. But we're not setting it against the systems that we have in place. And are the systems correct? Do they need improving to prevent this challenge coming up again? And in the absence of that, we just become busy.
Yeah.
So your question of can a sales organisation perform well, etc., in the absence of a good strategy, it can perform to a level, but it will never perform at its highest level.
Yeah, I love that, and I love the idea that just to check back into defaults. One of the things we do quite a bit with strategy is think about how do you do it in an intentional, designed way, but also then how do we track how the underlying assumptions are changing and evolving over times, and the things that we designed 10 years ago might not be fit for purpose now, whether that's changes in society, technology, all these different things. So actually, there's a really intentional way of doing strategy where you're kind of testing and evolving the systems on an ongoing basis.
I'm a big believer in the idea of consistency in what we do, and I think a system and so on provides that. And I'm a big believer in consistency even if you are wrong. It's better to be consistently wrong than randomly correct, because if I sometimes get it right, sometimes get it wrong, then it's very difficult to identify where. Because consistency enables us to unpick, enables us to look at what's working and what's not, and then to make the necessary changes. If I'm operating in an inconsistent way, randomly, I don't know what's working. And the example I use there is maybe a golf professional. So if I go to improve my swing, one of the things they will look at is what am I doing consistently? It's much easier for them to correct that than if every time I take a shot, I do it differently. And so again, I look at the systems, we'll often talk in a sales environment about things like sales process. A lot of sales people don't necessarily like the idea of a process. They think process is bureaucracy, slows you down, but it doesn't. The idea of a process is this the way that we should be doing something? And to your point, over time it will evolve. Market dynamics change, customer requirements change, our own offering may well change. So our process should reflect all of that. But if we don't have it in place, or if we don't have it documented, or we don't understand it, what is it I'm seeking to improve?
Yeah. And without building our own 2Cs framework, the other one that really is relevant for me is this idea of being coherent. So actually, rather than just kind of shooting off with different ideas all the time, that by being consistent and coherent, you're kind of pulling in one direction, and things will adapt and change, but it fits like one story rather than a kind of unconnected set of decisions that kind of pull in different directions.
Yeah, and I think that cohesion there is really important, and it's around our actions and the activities we take, but it's also building up to what the outcome is that we're trying to achieve. I mentioned earlier around things like a chief revenue officer who should have responsibility for certain levers within that revenue growth area. Often I'll see organisations where these functions are not working well together, marketing and sales and service and so on. And as individuals, they may well be achieving their objectives, but do those objectives, are they really aligned in then delivering what's required? And you see this a lot in things like demand generation. So marketing may well have responsibility for that, both in terms of making awareness to customers, but also outbound or inbound activity that may be coming through. They could well be ticking and achieving their objectives. But if those objectives are not coherent and aligned with what sales then require and how that moves forward, you end up with individuals who, I've done my bit, but we've not achieved the outcome that we're looking for.
So as we move towards wrapping up, we've got our last feature, which we've done in every podcast so far, the first and this one, which is best worst. So I'm going to ask you the best and worst questions. So what do you see the best sales leaders doing right now?
The best CROs are recognizing that it's not all about them, but it is all about them. In terms of it's not all about them, it's recognizing the support that they need to put in place for their teams. that their only success is through the success of their teams. But it is all about them in the sense of sales is still quite a macho environment, work hard, play hard type approach. But what they're recognizing is they need support, and they're prepared to step out and look for coaching, mentorship, recognizing that they don't have all of the answers themselves, and actually it's better questions that they're looking for.
And I had to think about this. So for our worst question, jumping back to our first podcast session with Stephen, talking about AI, we've not even talked about technology much, but it's going to be shaping sales as it's shaping so many other areas. What are your worst case predictions for how AI will impact sales?
That's a great question. Your last podcast touched upon AI, and it's an area obviously we can't get away from, and it has a significant impact in sales. For me, the area I want to explore or look at is what does it do in terms of our pipeline of people development, and in particular leaders. I saw an interview recently of an organization that had replaced 10 entry-level account executives with 20 AI agents. Now it's working for them, and that's great. The challenge I see is that if we replace these entry-level roles that lead us into sales, where people cut their teeth, they get that experience, they build that resilience. If we remove that, then where do people enter into the profession? What does it look like for them? And this is something that I think as leaders we need to be conscious of. We need to be aware of the longer term impact of this over the immediate gain that we're seeing now.
Well, that wraps up our podcast today. Thanks very much, Simon, for coming along and sharing with us. I've learnt loads from Simon, even in the year or so that I've known him. If you want to dig into it further, I would definitely recommend his book. And so check that out. We'll put some links down below. And yeah, thanks for joining us. Any feedback, comments, suggestions, we'd love to hear from you.